Welcome everyone to my YouTube channel, Video Chess Training. I'm International Master William Paschall. Today we're going to take a look at a game from the recent Tata tournament in the Netherlands. White is Magnus Carlsen, world champion, and black is Russian champion Yevgeny Tomashevky. Carlsen opens with 1 d4. Tomashevky, knight to f6. Knight f3 from Carlsen, flexible move. And then Tomashevky plays e6. Black is normally aiming for a Nimzo Indian, Bogo Indian, possibly a transposition to a double queen pawn game or c5. But Carlsen trumps them all with the move bishop f4. Tomashevky may have spent countless hours preparing for this game with the world champion Carlsen. But here, I think that he was already on his own as far as preparation is concerned. Bishop f4 is a solid opening, one of the most solid setups White can employ. But it's rarely seen at the top grandmaster level, because I think it's not really that ambitious for White. Tomashevky burned a lot of time. He played the move b6, and now b6 is one of many options. Black can play more aggressively here with c5. I think this is the critical line. But a lot of players, especially ones who play the Queen's Indian, comfortable with the move b6, and has a quite solid reputation for Black. e3 from White, and obviously White has the option to play c4. But c4 and bishop f4 against the Queen's Indian is a line that actually isn't played by very many top grandmasters. Grandmaster Tony Miles, who passed away a few years ago, was one of the world-leading experts in that variation, but again, it's fairly rare, so usually White will follow up with c3. So b6, bishop b7, h3. This is a classic London system move. d4, e3, knight f3, bishop f4. This is the London system. And h3 is a move to preserve the bishop's diagonal in the event of knight h5. Bishop e7, bishop d3, and so far we're completely in standard London system territory. Now castles. White often plays knight d2 before castling, but in 98.5% of games, White is castling kingside in this opening. I've had students who recklessly try to attack on the kingside with moves like g4. It's the exception rather than the rule in this kind of line. So c5 now from Black. I like this move. Other setups based on d5 are perfectly playable, but if you go back to the games from 100 years ago, you look at the games of Akiba Rubinstein, he did exceedingly well against this classical kind of d4, d5 setup, where White uses the e5 square as an outpost for his pieces. So I think modern chess players have mostly moved toward a setup that's a little bit more dynamic for Black. c5 and probably d6 with a hedgehog type of pawn formation is the most popular and I think the best for Black. So c5 and now c3. This is a quiet move. White could also play knight on b to d2, possibly queen e2. Knight to c6. Now this is a position where Black has played many games in the chess database, and many different moves have been tried. Pretty much any reasonable move in this position has been played, but I think the most reliable move for Black is d6. d6 with the idea of placing the knight on d7, where it's most harmonious in the hedgehog type of position. Once you play knight c6, you can have problems trying to reach a hedgehog type of position. Oftentimes Black might even have to bring the knight back to b8 and back to d7, and this has occurred in some of my own games to try to reach the optimal formation for the hedgehog. The hedgehog being the pawn formation a6, b6, d6, e6, etc. So here Tomashevky plays knight to c6. Other moves have been played, as I said, d6, a6 is an example of a reasonable move for Black there, another hedgehog type of move. So after knight c6, knight on b to d2, the problem is, I understand now, Tomashevky probably doesn't want to play a hedgehog with his knight on c6, so he opts for d5. we've basically transposed to a d4, d5 type of London system now, where white has good control over the e5 square. And again, if you look at the games in history, white has enjoyed a lot of nice victories based on his kingside superiority and control of the e5 square. Queen e2 now from Carlsen. This is a good sort of waiting move. I found one game in the chess database, Gingiashvili versus Sakis, where I believe this was a blitz game in 2002. White played knight e5, and after knight e5, knight takes e5. Would be interesting to consider pawn takes e5 here. But in this game, white played bishop takes e5, and Sakis played queen c8 with the idea of bishop a6. This is like a Stonewall Dutch sort of idea. Gingiashvili played queen e2, and black played a5, preparing to trade off the bishop. Sakis, of course, a great French player, so no surprise he knows how to trade off a bad bishop when he gets the chance. Anyway, I thought black equalized in that game pretty handily. So that's one way to play against knight e5. Carlsen apparently aware of this strategy, probably, just trying to prevent that for one thing with queen e2. He's against this whole idea of queen c8. So Tomashevky plays bishop d6, and this is an interesting position where white could play knight e5, but if knight e5, I think black has queen c7. And I've worked with some students in this type of position. The problem is, to support the knight on e5, you have to play the move knight f3, and I think that gives black the chance to play the move knight e4 in some positions. So giving up the e4 square, not really what white wants to do in this kind of setup. In another Grandmaster game, Vladimir Georgiev played bishop g5, but this move also most likely not really dangerous for black. Grandmaster Quesada, I believe, played h6, and after bishop h4, bishop e7, white enjoyed a very small edge. So bishop g5, an interesting alternative. Carlsen also not playing that. He played the queen e2 idea. And then bishop d6, bishop g5. A new move here, rook on f to e1. This is Carlsen's novelty, if you will, but it's a little hard for me to believe that Magnus has actually prepared this far for white in a totally obscure variation of the London system. Possible, but unlikely. I think this is more like over-the-board inspiration. Rook on f to e1, and just kind of waiting. But I don't objectively think this is really dangerous for black. At this point, black should most likely take on f4, and after bishop takes f4, e takes f4, take on d4, isolating the pawn on d4. And although white has a little more space, he has a kind of tough decision here. I looked at two lines. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, c takes d, queen d6, with the idea of hitting this pawn, and probably best is queen e3. After something like rook on a to c8, a3 maybe, and white has a tiny infinitesimal advantage, perhaps with the idea of playing f5, but I really don't think this is that dangerous a position for black. This would have been a solid approach. And the other way might even be better for black. If you take with a c pawn, black has queen d6 again, and after queen e3, the simplifying move knight b4 in this position. So I'm not sure this is really dangerous for black, although white has a small spatial advantage. Seems that black's pretty much going to be okay. This was a safe way for black to play. Instead, he played another move that's reasonable, knight on c to e7. And interesting to note that later in this tournament, Sergei Karyakin also played bishop f4, sort of copying Carlsen, but he made an odd choice of which opponent to do it against. Against a young player, a very tactical player, the London system might be a good way to get them out of sharp positions, but Karyakin decided to play it against Michael Adams, and I think this was a strange decision. Adams, I think, one of the best positional players, probably quite at home in this closed structure. Adams playing a different type of position. This was before white was castled in that game. Karyakin played very recklessly and lost with white, with the king still in the center. But another game that might be interesting to analyze. So, knight e7, and things get interesting now. Rook on a to d1, another very neutral move from Carlsen. I don't think that black has any serious problems here. Now, knight to g6, and white, after this move, is able to claim a slight advantage. Very small advantage. Bishop takes g6. This is amounting to the same thing as trading on d6. Bishop takes g6, h takes g6, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and white is able to claim a slight edge here with the move knight e5. But this is a very small edge we're talking about. At this point, Tomashevky has used quite a bit more time than Carlsen, and started to worry, I'm sure, that he's drifting into a slightly passive position. And he decided to kind of take a stand. He didn't like the double pawns on the king side. Actually, white has the idea of playing h4 or f4, which is going to freeze those double pawns. So I'm really not sure what the best move is for black here. But g5 is quite interesting. It's also a little bit dangerous, but I think that Tomashevky, I think the move's probably justified. It's going to take some creativity to make it work. But g5 is a very ambitious move, and I think against a lesser player, it would have given Tomashevky a fairly easy route to equality. But against Carlsen, things are not so simple. This is where the game really starts to get interesting. Now, a normal player, I don't know, in this position, would have found some sort of modest move, most likely. But perhaps the text move. However, when you look at this text move in context, f4, and you think about the fact that it's coming from a player who's rated 2844, and you're playing the black pieces here, I think the warning lights need to go off, because Carlsen, he's not going to let you just smash his pawn structure, g takes f and c takes d, and give him isolated pawns, play queen b4, and exploit the better pawn structure for black. It's not that easy. Black has a bad bishop, but there's really nothing Tomashevky can do. He was no doubt, aware of the possibility of f4, but I'm willing to bet that he didn't foresee that after g takes f4, Carlsen wasn't going to recapture. Tomashevky probably assumed that white was going to take on f4, when, for example, he could take on d4 and play knight e4. I mean, something like cd, cd, and knight e4, when black has this e4 square forever, which makes it very hard for white to make progress. So, kudos to Carlsen, for coming up with the most creative solution in a kind of harmless, relatively harmless looking position, creating problems for his opponent, just as he did against Luke Van Wely in an earlier round. Tremendous practical decisions. Rook f1, this is a fantastic idea, but I don't think it's enough for white to actually force a win. I think it's probably a draw with best play. So at this point, Tomashevky was getting a little bit lower on time, and he started to play more and more passively. But the critical question here, at this point in the position, is can black take on e3? Because Tomashevky was shy to try to do that, but I think this variation is absolutely critical. So if we take on e3, what's going on here? Carlsen could take back and be down a pawn and have some compensation based on his active pieces and strong knight in e5, but I don't think that was the plan. I think the plan is to play rook takes f6. And so, in this position, the question is what's happening now. And there's some nasty traps in this position. If you play g takes f6, queen g4 check, something like king h8, white has chances to play for a win here by sacrificing all or most of his pieces. You can analyze this with the computer engine in detail, but I can assure you that I think there's more than a draw here by repetition for white. But what's not really clear to me is Carlsen's intention in the event of pawn takes d2, because I'm not so convinced by this. After pawn takes d2, queen h5, pawn takes f6. White has something like knight to g4, but it's not really convincing. So I'm not that sure about this position being a winning position for white. Obviously, after queen h5, pawn takes pawn, we have a draw. This is the main line, I guess. Takes, check, and repetition with queen g4, queen h4. I really don't think white has enough to play for more. So it seems a little bit like it's something of a bluff by Carlsen against Tomashevky here. After pawn takes e3, the only scary move is rook takes f6, and g takes f6 is very, very dangerous for black. But pawn takes d2, the pawn here, it can be ignored, but it's tying up the rook on d1, so it's going to be very hard for white to actually use the rook on d1 as a fourth piece against black in an attack here. So with that in mind, queen h5 probably the best move, and it's hard to see better than a draw by repetition for white. So I think Carlsen sort of got away with a sort of bluff here. He was never in any danger, but I think that Tomashevky sort of panicked. He was afraid that there was more there than there really was, and he could have probably forced Carlsen to take a draw by repetition. Maybe there's some other line. You can put it in the comments here on YouTube, but I don't see anything convincing. So after g takes f4, rook f1, Tomashevky plays knight d7, which is very timid, but nevertheless, a reasonable move. So now queen h5. We talked about rook f1 is a creative, brilliant move by Carlsen, a brilliant practical move. And here, this is again extremely, extremely strong threats for white after knight h5. Sorry, queen h5. If pawn takes e3, there's no question anymore. Knight takes f7 and it's lights out. Black is just lost. So it looks pretty dangerous for black. This was obviously not Tomashevsky's intention. Now he's getting lower and lower on time. He missed what was probably a forced draw on Carlsen's sort of bluff on the last move. And now he's in a real danger, and he plays knight back to f6. Now, not all hope is lost, but Carlsen has drastically improved the position of his queen with this trick. And now, queen h4. And this is another very accurate move, because the quiet queen e2 I don't think is dangerous for black. So queen h4. And now black plays queen d8. This is another timid move by Tomashevky. Difficult to suggest better. I think now it's too dangerous to take on e3. Now we have some serious threats. One of them, which is very interesting, is the move. I don't know if this has been analyzed. But again, rook takes f6, though, is similar to the other variation. I'm not sure white has anything here after pawn takes d2. But instead of rook takes f6, quite interesting is knight f3. I don't know if this was Magnus's idea, but it's very interesting. Knight on d to f3, e2, knight g5, when black is in kind of a virtual paralysis. And if you analyze this with a computer engine, eventually black will probably come around to the realization that apparently the best move is something like bishop a6, which is sort of entertaining, but in this position, white is possibly winning here. So minimum draw, but I think when I looked at this, white very well may be winning in this position. So this is not what Tomashevky wants to do. Queen d8 is okay. The other interesting move here, I think, is at some point black can play knight h7. He might be able to take on d4 at some point as well, but queen d8 is okay. Rook takes f4. Yeah, here he should think about knight h7. This is maybe one of the best ways to bail out. I think white is a little bit better. I'm not sure if Carlsen would have found it. Probably. He has queen takes d8, and rook on a takes d8, and then d takes c, b takes c, knight b3, highlighting the weakness of this pawn. So this variation looks difficult for black. There's not really too much better than, say, rook c8, knight d7, and black loses this pawn on c5. So perhaps Tomaszewski's move is the best. Rather than losing material, he gives white a slightly better endgame after the text move, knight e4. But this is the wrong way to go about it. At this point, he has to try c takes d4 first, because he loses the game in the ending because of the weakness of his c-pawn. If he does this first, I'm not sure if Magnus had anything up his sleeve. Perhaps rook f1 at this point was Carlsen's idea. It looks quite interesting, but I'm not 100% sure about it. It may be good. So that deserves some further investigation. The way that Tomaszewski played it, though, knight e4 leaves him in a tragic endgame. Knight takes e4. It looks visually kind of okay for black because of a number of things. Queen takes h4, rook takes h4. The white rook is way out in limbo on h4. In the endgame, the bishop might prove to be a decent piece, especially after d takes e4, and the pawn on e4 is cutting the rook off. But unfortunately, Carlsen gets a rook on the 7th rank, which is very powerful, and he actually has a winning position here. But again, visually, when you look at the position, after d takes c, b takes c, he had to take back because the threat of c6 is too strong. Visually, it looks like maybe black has some drawing chances. The rook is very misplaced on h4, and you'll see what happens here next. Rook d7 and rook b8, this is the best move. Now b3, also probably the best move, securing the pawn on b2. And immediately Tomaszewski tries to get some counterplay with a5. a5, a4, which seems like a good idea, trying to break up the pawns. Rook c7, and now Carlsen is threatening to go 2 pawns up. So obviously this is a desperate situation for Tomaszewski. He plays a4. B takes a4, and now bishop to a8, because bishop d5 would be met by c4, obviously. So this position is lost for white. Lost for black, but the black pawn structure seems a little better than white's. White has double isolated a pawns, isolated c pawn, and an isolated e pawn. So I would think that Tomaszewski against a lesser player would have chances to sort of swindle a draw here. Against Carlsen's technique, probably not. In the actual game, Carlsen plays a5. Pass pawns must be pushed. Rook b7, neutralizing the rook on the 7th, but obviously losing this pawn. Rook takes c5. He gets the rook to the best possible square. Rook a7, where it guards the 7th and keeps the a pawn under surveillance. But after this, knight to c4, the pawn is guarded, and white is up 2 pawns. He's winning here, basically. But I think that against a lesser player, Tomaszewski could have played on. The game ended here with a victory for Carlsen. For example, if bishop d5, knight b6, and you can't really give up the e4 pawn. I mean, it's just very important. Bishop takes a2, rook takes e4. All the white's pieces would start to coordinate and get into the game. So without this bishop d5, it looks like Tomaszewski doesn't have much. Perhaps something like rook to d8. But I think the win is not far off for Carlsen. He can bring his rook back into the game with rook f4, prepare to bring it back to rook f2, where it can go to d2, b2, sort of secure everything, shore it up. And the black bishop just can't really get in the game again. Always meeting bishop d5 with knight b6. Carlsen is winning here. So in the actual game, the whole party ended basically with the move knight to c4. Again, I don't think black should resign against a weaker grandmaster. But against the world champion Magnus Carlsen, Carlsen's technique is very good, and I'm sure he wouldn't have given black any respite had the game continued. So I thought this was an interesting game. from the Tata tournament 2016. Magnus Carlsen playing the London system, taking Tomashevky out of book, forcing him to use a lot of time early. An excellent practical win by Carlsen, but I think that Tomashevky should have equalized with black. And interesting choice in the opening. Tomashevky not playing the more normal hedgehog type of formation, which seems the most flexible against the London. Also, check out the game that Michael Adams played as black against Karyakin if you can find it online. That was an interesting game. Also in the London system, Karyakin going crazy, leaving his king in the center and playing va-bank, but getting bonked by Michael Adams in the end. He was totally lost with the white pieces against the positional maestro, Michael Adams. So, good, interesting chess from Tata 2016. This was International Master William Paschall for my YouTube channel, Video Chess Training, and I hope you enjoyed the show.